Good evening, everybody, and welcome back. On a cold February evening in 1996, John Perry Barlow, a former lyricist for the Grateful Dead, sat down to write what would become one of his best remembered pieces. It wasn't a song that he composed that night, but something grander, a declaration of independence, written on behalf of the people of cyberspace. From whom were the people of cyberspace declaring independence? From governments, all of them. Governments of the industrial world, he wrote, you wary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. You have neither solicited nor received ours. We did not invite you, you do not know us, nor do you know our world. Cyberspace does not lie within your borders. It's a fascinating document, one that reveals how utopian visions of the internet flourished in its earliest days. Cyberspace was imagined as a realm beyond the reach of law or regulation, where people of the world could come together. Central to this vision was a deep commitment to free expression. As Barlow said, we're creating a world where anyone, anywhere, may express his or her beliefs, no matter how singular, without fear of being coerced into silence or conformity. And in the years since, we've heard echoes of this aspiration. Reddit co-founder Alexis Ohanian once suggested that the founding fathers themselves would really like Reddit. Why? Because, as he said, it is a bastion of free speech on the World Wide Web. And Twitter executives famously referred to their company as the free speech wing of the Free Speech Party. This commitment to free expression and the openness it fostered are in part responsible for some extraordinary developments. Activists across the political spectrum and around the world have used digital tools to build powerful movements for social change, from the Arab Spring to the Tea Party to Black Lives Matter. Communication channels once reserved for political and economic elites, television networks and newspapers, have been blown open, allowing billions to engage in global conversations that previous generations could only have imagined. People like John Perry Barlow believed that connecting all of humanity online would be to our benefit. And some of their optimism was warranted. Global citizens of the internet can, and sometimes will, share inspiring stories or deliberate about issues of public concern or arrive at a common understanding across significant political and cultural divides. But if Twitter of today is any indication, that's certainly not all they're likely to do. In addition to genuine discourse and chatter and memes that don't harm anyone, we also see some content that ranges from toxic to tragic. Hate speech aimed at the most marginalized among us, hyper-targeted political messaging used to influence elections, coordinated efforts to silence certain groups, the promulgation of vast and complicated conspiracy theories, and disinformation campaigns that have real consequences. Odious as some of this may be, much of this content, at least in this country, is constitutionally protected speech. In a traditional public square, white supremacists are allowed to march openly. A motivated conspiracy theorist can stand on the street corner and declare that the earth is flat or that vaccines increase the risk of autism without fear of being silenced. These are the protections guaranteed to them by the First Amendment in a country that, for reasons we've discussed here before, prizes civil liberties as foundational for a democratic society. But does the fact that many of these forms of speech are protected in public mean that they should also be protected online? Even if founders of digital platforms champion the spirit of free speech, private companies aren't themselves bound exclusively by the First Amendment, or for that matter, by the speech permissions of the other countries in which they operate. Beyond compliance with the law, they're free to define their own policies and standards. So, when confronted with violent or exploitative content, what's a global platform to do? Should they take it down, let it stay, downrank it in people's feeds so they're far less likely to see it? Do they need to explain to us what they've done and how they've done it? What about in instances where different countries have different norms, such as the case with something like Holocaust denial, which is protected in the United States, but illegal in many European nations? Or where cultural sensitivities differ, as around nudity or homosexuality or criticizing your government? Or where the context of something is what makes it harmful, like Pepe the Frog, a seemingly innocuous cartoon that the far right adopted as a symbol of intolerance. There have long been debates about how best to protect and govern speech, but doing this work in a digital context presents some new challenges, ones that are further complicated by the contested role that private platforms play in disseminating news and information. Perhaps digital platforms, at least those beyond a certain size, constitute a new type of public space. In the words of Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey, a lot of people come to Twitter and they don't actually see an app or service. They see what looks like a public square, and they have the same sort of expectations as a public square. Alternatively, we might think of digital platforms as just a modern version of the postman or the telephone network, the carriers of our messages, but nothing more. If you and I plot a treacherous murder over the phone, we wouldn't think to implicate AT&T in that crime. Aren't these platforms just like that, the pipes or common carriers of our messages to one another? Of course, in that case, they couldn't be held responsible for the content generated by billions of users. But wait, maybe platforms are more like newspapers or radio broadcasters. Facebook, Twitter, and the rest don't just display content, they curate it, determining what's on my proverbial front page, similar in some ways to a media outlet. That would make them publishers, though, which would suggest that they should be responsible for what they host and who sees it. Each of these frameworks provides a helpful but imperfect analogy for conceptualizing digital platforms. Public spaces, common carriers, and publishers are regulated in their own distinct and familiar ways. By contrast, platforms at times operate as or claim to be akin to each of these, and it sometimes seems that we as users want an impossible combination from them. We want platforms to remove harmful content, but not, under any circumstance, to censor vital political speech. We want them to treat content neutrally, but not to flood us with irrelevant information. And we want them to give us control over what news and information we see, even as we happily consume the curated news feeds and playlists that they recommend to us. Making things even trickier, the content we see on platforms like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Reddit, and others isn't simply the product of automated systems, but the result of human moderation done by tens of thousands of content reviewers around the world. Real people whose job it is to apply guidelines and make judgments about what we see online. Their work is both morally complicated and psychologically taxing. Many Facebook moderators, for example, spend their days reviewing some of the most disturbing content of the web, and often as contractors with pay and benefits far below those of full-time employees. But the power of these so-called custodians of the internet, whether human, algorithmic, or otherwise, is immense. Ranging from Twitter's handling of Russian propaganda bots during American elections, to Facebook's efforts to stem ethnic violence fueled by its platform, the decisions of private platforms can have significant geopolitical ramifications. And problems with content are only one instantiation of a larger question. Namely, what power should these private platforms, whose products now seem essential for our civic and social lives, have in a democratic society? In a lot of ways, Mark Zuckerberg once said, Facebook is more like a government than a traditional company. We have this large community of people, and more than other technology companies, we're really setting policies. If he's right, then 2 decades after John Perry Barlow declared the independence of cyberspace, we may well live in a world where cyberspace is not independent after all. Instead, it merely has a new set of rulers, the digital platforms that, like Zuckerberg explained, function as governments in their own right. In the process, we have to ask, are we losing sight of the types of regulations and accountability measures that are needed to ensure that these new powers act in the interest of the online citizens? And if at some point we decide that these platforms simply have too much power, do we possess the requisite tools to check or challenge them? Tonight, as always, we are joined by a group of distinguished experts to help us sort through these questions and others. First, we have Krishna Bharat, a technologist focused on the intersection of computing and journalism. He was formerly a distinguished scientist at Google and was the founder of Google News, an automated news aggregation and search service with more than 100,000 sources and 72 editions worldwide. Prior to that, he started Google Research in 1999. He serves on the boards of Columbia School of Journalism, the John S. Knight Journalism Fellowships at Stanford, and the Committee to Protect Journalists. And at Stanford, he is one of the leads of the Journalism and Democracy Initiative. Then we have Marita Shaka. She's a Dutch politician and has been serving as a member of the European Parliament since 2009. In addition to serving on a variety of parliamentary committees, she's the founder of the European Parliament Intergroup on the Digital Agenda for Europe. In 2017, she was chief of the European Union Election Observation Mission in Kenya and is a member of the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity, the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, and the chair of the Task Force on Software Vulnerability Disclosure in Europe, and she's also an advisor to the Center for Humane Technology. And finally, we have with us Alex Stamos, who is a cybersecurity expert working to improve the security and safety of the internet through his teaching and research here at Stanford, where he is an adjunct professor and fellow and visiting scholar at the Hoover Institution. Prior to joining Stanford, Alex served as the chief security officer of Facebook, where he led a team of engineers, researchers, investigators, and analysts charged with understanding and mitigating information security risks to the company and safety risks to the 2.5 billion people on Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. During his time at Facebook, he also led the company's investigation into manipulation of the 2016 election and helped pioneer several successful protections against these new classes of abuse. Before joining Facebook, Alex was the chief information security officer at Yahoo. Please join me in welcoming our guests to the stage.
All right, as folks get seated, I'm going to start off the questions. I want to build, as always, on what it is that Hillary provided us in an opening framework, and to talk about the interesting evolution of the internet or cyberspace as a zone or a realm apart from government, and then the evolution of large companies, these big platforms, into quasi-like governments themselves. I want to use the words of a British historian named Timothy Garton Ash, who spends summers here at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. And in a book about free speech in an online world, he describes whatever Google does with respect to expression online as far more important than what Germany does. Whatever Facebook's content moderation policies are far more consequential in the world than whatever France has to say about content and expression. And so what I'm curious to ask any of our panelists about is this new world in which just a small number of platforms, which are the sites of our digital expression, our speech, video, audio, all of these places where we now associate and express ourselves online, which in the United States at least, if we were doing it in an analog fashion in a public square, barking on the public square street corner, would be protected by the First Amendment. But the First Amendment does not apply to private companies. They can set their own terms of speech. And these content moderation strategies or handbooks are extraordinarily powerful. And the content moderation comes in two forms. It's the banning and deletion of content, and then the algorithmic up-ranking and down-ranking of content. Now, if these companies are like governments, a la what Facebook or Jack Dorsey has to say, One thing to point out here is that whereas the United States and places in Europe, the actual governments are democratic governments responsive to citizens. Facebook is like a dictatorship that's responsive to exactly one person, a beneficent technocrat named Mark Zuckerberg. You can debate the beneficent part if you want. What I want to know is how we should think about the private superpowers that are now amongst us that govern our speech and expression online that are not democratic, and how to think about the tension between actual democratic governments and the guarantees of speech and the private governance of speech by these quasi-governmental, non-democratic tech companies. Anyone want to weigh in?
So
Easy stuff, yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, no.
So I want to challenge the notion that the companies think of themselves as governments, firstly. But even if they do, they don't have an autocracy because their users can walk away, so they can vote with their feet, right? So they, as Hillary pointed out, all the speech there is protected by the First Amendment. The only reason there should be anything that's stopped is because the community wants it that way. It's not like Mark Zuckerberg particularly wants that content out of the way. It's just that the community of users that uses his product want it that way. So they're setting the norms. Of course, they can't agree, right? And different countries have different communities and different sensibilities, as was articulated. So it's a big mess because there isn't a uniform definition of what belongs and what doesn't belong. Mm-hmm. It's a lot easier when the content you're displaying is the product of a search or something, when it's sort of active consumption. When I've said I'm looking for AT&T, and then you get the first result is AT&T. That's kind of straightforward. It's non-controversial. But the moment it's passive consumption, where something is suggested to you based on some profile, then there's this whole big question mark in what's appropriate, and then the ranking gets invoked, and then they get accused of being editors and so forth. So it's not a simple answer, but the fact is, I don't think it's the companies making all the decisions, nor do they want to. It's the community that surrounds the company that wants certain standard sets, and hence all the complexity.
Yeah, I think they're acting in a quasi-governmental manner. The companies are defining what is legitimate political speech in locations around the world. They're defining what does it mean to be an authentic speaker and what level of anonymity or pseudo-anonymity are you allowed to have in different circumstances. They operate intelligence teams. So I had an intelligence team that spoke a variety of languages, including experts in the intelligence activities of the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. They operate law enforcement teams. So we had a counterterrorism team. We had a child exploitation team. We had a team specifically around fraud. So it's, while obviously there are some significant differences, the companies are acting in quasi-governmental manner, partially because the governments have not stepped up into this space. Mm-hmm. So almost by definition, all of the content that is being moderated on these platforms is content that has been at some point adjudicated as actually being legally protected. So almost without question, in democracies at least, they will take down any content that there is a court order to take down. And so when we argue about the speech rights, the baseline is things that are legal or not legal within that jurisdiction, and all of the decisions are on top of that, and it is decisions that basically the governments have kind of wiped their hands of, or like in the United States, are restricted from doing anything about because of the First Amendment. And so, or the companies are stepping into the breach because the government's not acting. So since 2016, the US Congress has done nothing to redefine the laws around political advertising online. In 2019, we have the exact same rules for political ads, including rules that it is not completely clear that it is illegal for Russians to run issue ads in the United States to try to drive division. And the changes there have all been made privately by the companies without any kind of democratic guidance.
One thing, I want to get Marita's comment here too, but just to make sure I pick up something you said there, Alex, which I think is important, is that you said something to the extent of, the companies are acting in this quasi-governmental fashion, but partly in response to a lack of clarity from actual governments in specifying what it is that should be legal or illegal online.
Right.
But that runs in the face of a common trope in Silicon Valley and in lots of other places, especially in the United States, which is an allergy or outright opposition to actual governmental regulation. So it's either happening by default, as it were. We don't get sufficient guidance about what should be permitted online. We'd prefer the public to decide rather than Mark Zuckerberg decide. But that instruction is not coming. But at the same time, speaking out of the other side of their mouth and saying we're opposed to governmental regulations in general. And maybe the European parliamentarian can comment on that
I think she can.
tension.
Yeah, she will try. Good evening. It's great to be here in Silicon Valley and to discuss these sort of tensions, really. The growth of impact and responsibility of the big technology platforms and the gap when it comes to accountability. Because you may sketch the notion that there is a community or constituency, if you want to call it that. And I've also seen Facebook users, for example, rising up and organizing against some measure or setting that Facebook has changed. But I think it should really not be compared to any kind of checks and balances that we believe are appropriate in a democratic system. People do not have the information. They do not have the sort of governance structures along which checks and balances and oversight are truly organized. So I think there is a huge accountability gap that is definitely the result of the rapid and enormous growth of these companies, the lack of oversight and transparency, and indeed the lack of lawmaking. And it is true that the tech platforms, until very, very recently, have consistently and systematically pushed back against any regulatory effort. This has been well documented, and I've seen it with my own eyes. The arguments were, if you regulate technology, you will stifle innovation. And the other often heard argument was, or is, that if we in liberal democracies are going to regulate technology, then China will take a cue from us and will also start regulating technology. Now, I think it's safe to say that they're not taking cues from us. I sort of wish they did. But the argument that we should not regulate or else China, I think, has sort of worn out. Instead, what I believe we need to do is to make sure that the principles that determine the fact that we are a liberal democracy, whether we're looking in Europe or the United States, are sustainable across different technological disruptions. And we have catching up to do, but I also believe it's in the tech companies' interest to get on board with this agenda, and not to resist it.
Jeremy.
So I want to push you a little bit further on this issue. You're the first elected legislator that we've had on our panel in the course of the discussions that we've had so far. And as an elected legislator, you respond to a different constituency than a company that's thinking about its users or its investors. And so I want you to talk a little bit for us about how you think about what is the public interest and what we need from our regulatory architecture to serve the public interest as opposed to the private interests of the companies themselves.
Mm-hmm. So I think the interesting thing is that most consumers are also citizens, but citizens are more than just consumers or users of these platforms, but oftentimes it overlaps. But indeed, the sort of incentives towards the boardroom or towards the government are very, very different, and vice versa as well. So what I believe is the public interest is to start with very principled notions that are, I believe, not very controversial. So think about non-discrimination. It's not allowed to distinguish in the treatment of people of different skin color, different ethnicity, different religion, different sexual orientation, gender, age, and so on and so on. But to actually make sure that non-discrimination is enforceable vis-a-vis business models that span the globe, that use different algorithms with both intended and unintended consequences, is something that needs work. So it doesn't necessarily need new laws, but it needs different ways of looking at how these laws can be implemented. And the same can be said for fair competition and antitrust, or the preservation of the freedom of expression, as Alex said, as it is encoded in the Constitution in the United States, different laws in Europe, to have that being leading and not a sort of normative notion of breastfeeding being inappropriate to show, or the mislabeling of certain news photos, for example, as being child pornography. I mean, to have the benchmark being the law, I believe should be the starting point to preserve the public interest. We can still talk about whether the laws are good enough, and there will always be disagreement about that in a democracy. But there are predictable, transparent, and accessible ways to change the laws through the legislative process, and I think that that is the avenue to take. So instead of thinking about, oh my goodness, we need all these new laws, and where do we begin, and cyberspace is apart from the real world, as John Perry Barlow so sort of poetically, but in some ways also, I think, prophetically tried to sketch at the time. We are now more than 20 years on, and while the libertarian sort of worldview that spoke from his Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace still lingers on in this part of the world, it is safe to say that cyberspace is not detached from the real world, and certainly not detached from real people. And I think that that should give us guidance in terms of where the public interest is and how we can safeguard it.
Let me ask one follow-up to this and invite Alex to respond afterward, which is to say, so Alex gave us the baseline. He said, look, anything that's actually against the law in any given context, you can just assume that the platforms, regardless of what country they're operating in, are taking that into account. And we can debate whether the companies should be in China or Saudi Arabia or not. That's an important decision that each of them need to make, but they are following the law. So the issue...
It's about content moderation,
yeah.
Which is only, I mean, it's a very important part, but it's certainly not everything. Okay.
So the issue becomes when we think as in the public interest, the impact of the platforms, say, has some negative effects on our civic culture, our civic deliberation, the health of our democracy more broadly. How do we think about who has the obligation to mitigate those costs? Should it really be in the hands of the legislators? They need to get their head around it. Can we even have agreement out of our political systems, as we've seen with debates in the United States with respect to content moderation, to get ahead of those things? You know, as Alex described, we can't even get transparency on political advertising in the United States, or much progress on foreign interference. So how do you think about the appropriate role of government with respect to dealing with those harms, and of companies themselves taking on the responsibility of self-regulation as those harms become evident?
Mm-hmm. So I think to clarify things a little bit, we're trying to distinguish between illegal speech according to the law of the land, and then the very gray area, slippery slope towards topics like fake news, or information that is going viral about conspiracies that can invite real life action, you know, allegations of child molestation in basements that then have people coming to the rescue, or the anti-vaccination information. I'm the daughter and sister of a doctor, and I recently saw this picture that I thought was saying more than 1,000 words, which was in a doctor's waiting room saying, please don't mistake your Google search for my medical degree. And I think that that is unfortunately something that people need to be reminded of, and where you could say, look, is it illegal to suggest that some kind of dance or some kind of diet can cure cancer? No. But is it scientifically proven that it will? No. And I think with now the anti-vaccination movement, you know, a recent article showed how on Amazon, which is very much used in this country, the algorithm was really boosting the promotion of books that challenge vaccinations, and there's now outbreaks of measles of levels that we haven't seen in a long time. So what I'm trying to sketch is that there are real harms of the distribution of information that may in and of itself not be illegal according to the law, but that still can have damaging impact on what I would call the public interest or public health in this example, so that it needs to be addressed. And where I think we have a big challenge is to make sure that we know better what the impact of these algorithms is.
So can I respond?
Yes.
If anti-vaccine messaging is a problem, then maybe there should be a law that says you not talk about it. Just like in certain countries you can't talk about deny the Holocaust or whatever. But in this country, for whatever reason, they've decided not to do it. So there is this gray zone, right? So now who gets to decide on a case-by-case basis each of these things is a problem? Now, in many of these cases, like anti-vaccine, it turns out that the only people writing anything, like there's a data void, right? If you search for certain kinds of things, the only people writing things about that tend to be the hoaxers, right? So, for example, if you search for the truth about climate change, like many of the things ends up on YouTube, for example, ends up being about climate change denial from Fox News, right? So there is an active element writing content for these kinds of topics, and unless there's clarity that this should be banned, it will be a function of what's available, right? So then it comes down to the pressure is on the search engines to get their ranking right.
Yes.
But by whose definition? In some cases, it's relatively clear. Like if the reliable sources are saying this, then they should be on the top, and I'm sure they would agree with you, and they will do their best to do it. But they can be contrived cases where either the reliable sources are not writing about it at all, or reliable sources also get fooled. In this case, the example I had of the truth about climate change was on Fox News.
Yeah, so I think this is not only about what law needs to ban what. I think this is really about responsibility of the companies that have perfected, but I mean not just perfected a little bit, but to a level of detail that none of us can truly comprehend. The matching of your search results, the likes to your friends, the kind of person you are with ads. So the level of detailed tweaking has allowed these companies to know people are pregnant before their doctor told them. I mean, this is going very, very far because they have statistics on the kind of searches that, briefly pregnant or, early pregnant women do, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea that the companies do not have the capability to do a lot, I just don't buy. The question is, can they engage in more transparency and allow for more research on the one hand about the intended and unintended consequences of their algorithms and business models, because I also believe that there are unintended consequences of the algorithms. And can we then see what is necessary, whether there is a need to ban certain information or not. But the incentives to stimulate the sharing and the high ranking of information are what I believe need to be scrutinized. Because if the incentive is to keep you online long, which is probably the incentive of YouTube, for example, because you could also go play soccer, cook something, watch television. You can go spend your attention and your time elsewhere. So everyone is competing for our time, including the tech platforms. So the incentive is probably to keep us long so that we can watch more ads, share more data, stay longer on YouTube. And so if it turns out that sensation sells, and it may just well be the case, right? Then there is an incentive to keep people looking at sensationalist stories. And this could be sensation about celebrities, it could be sensation about politicians, could be sensation about health, could be sensation about food scares and whatnot. And if it happens by 3 people, there may not be a problem. If it happens by 3 million people, 30 million people, then it changes. And in Europe, when we look at competition and antitrust, there's a very important notion that is called significant market power, which weighs the impact of behavior. For example, if you have price agreements, if you and I have a price agreement about selling 1 or 2 products, we're in a different kind of scrutiny than if we do the same for products reaching millions of people, and if our market share is, let's say, 80% in a certain market. So the question of how big a problem is or how big a market share is should factor into this, because it determines how big the impact is of a certain algorithm or service.
Alex, do you want to get in on this? And then Maron's going to get the question.
So I think one of the reasons the tech companies are fine with regulation now is they want to call the bluff a bit of politicians. Because there's this whole set of criticisms that ignore the fact that these are actually optimization trade-offs, that you can't have your cake and eat it too. So like there's a famous saying in engineering, you can have something done quickly, done cheaply, or done correctly, pick 2 of 3, right? And there's a bunch of trade-offs here, and the 2 most obvious for the things we're talking about is the trade-off between the power of the platforms and their responsibility for curating content, and then there's a serious trade-off between privacy and safety. Right, and so you have these criticisms like that effectively boil down to Facebook is way too powerful, and I want that power to be used to squash this stuff I do not like, or Facebook needs to know nothing about anybody, and they need to find all the bad guys, right? You can't have those things. And so I think what's going to have to happen in this regulatory context is now we're going to have to, what's happened is all the platforms, and like imagine this triangle of optimization between privacy, security, monetization, authenticity versus anonymity. They're picking these places in the middle, and they get criticized from all sides. And so they're basically saying, okay, that's fine, pick for us. And what's happened so far is that there has been serious mixed messages, especially in Europe, where the way the federal system works is that you have a pure privacy message from the federal level, from the European Parliament and the European Commission in the form of GDPR, the General Data Privacy Regulation, and then you have lots of asks from state governments to help with the enforcement of laws. And an anecdote that showed this for me, this is before GDPR, but a lot of the same privacy laws were actually in place in Europe before GDPR. I had a couple of meetings in a European capital, not Marita, but a different one. And the first day we met with people from the Interior Ministry, which in European countries are often responsible for internal security. And we had helped them catch a very bad person. And that person went to jail. Their cops took credit for it, not us. But they would not have caught this very bad person without us. And they said, thank you so much for doing that. How can we work together? And then the second day we met with the Data Protection Commissioner, and they gave us a list of pieces of data. And on that list of pieces of data, for which it was a violation of the fundamental human rights of their citizens, included the data necessary to catch that bad guy. And the message we gave them is like, you guys are both from the same government. You should figure out, what do you want, right? You can't have both perfect enforcement of the rules and safety for your citizens and all of this privacy. Privacy also goes to the bad guys. And I think that is going to be the difficult place, is where do we find the optimization on this? And I'm sure we'll talk about this. I think to a certain extent, the big Mark Zuckerberg letter of today is calling the bluff on that, and forcing kind of the critics to actually take a side. Because so far, for people in the tech industry, it's not comfortable to do all these things, and then no matter what you do, no matter how much you struggle with these difficult equities and measure it, that people that have to take no responsibility for the outcomes get to criticize you for it, and then also imply that you are bad people because you made a difficult equity choice. And so punting that to democracies is a good thing. The problem is that most of the countries that the tech companies operate in are not democracies, or are democracies that do not have significant human rights standards built in their constitutions. So punting it to governments is great in the Netherlands, not so great in most of the world. And that's another challenge that we're gonna really see.
I'll be happy to talk to the people at Facebook one day to make them feel better, because what you're describing is sort of the position politicians are in all the time, you know? Can't win, damned if you do, damned if you don't. But the example that you gave about the not to be mentioned government and the sort of friction between intelligence and law enforcement and data protection, you could also see as a healthy part of checks and balances. I mean, it is actually normal that there is an independent authority also checking the Interior Ministry and keeping them sharp on data protection. So I understand that it's frustrating for a company.
Except they shouldn't both be punishing the same company, right? Like, they should be working that out with each other, not like, we're going to fine you, and we're going to fine you, and we're going to sue you, and we're going to sue you. That's where it gets silly. It's just, it's not productive, and it doesn't reflect. It's a special dysfunction in Europe because the European federal system doesn't care about national security, does not have the national security and law enforcement responsibility. And so at least in the United States, if the FBI and the FTC disagree, they both report to the president. But it is unclear to me how something bad's going to happen. Under GDPR, there's going to be a terrorist attack, or there's going to be Russian interference in a European election. Mm-hmm. And the tech companies are actually going to be super happy because the data is going to be gone because of GDPR, and so they can't get blamed for it. And they're going to say, I'm sorry, I can't investigate this for you. I don't have the data anymore. And then that's going to be a fascinating question, is how in this European system, where you have a government in Brussels that feels very distant from the government in some of these countries, how are they going to work out the outcome of this? And I'm a little afraid. I would hope that people would figure it out now while everybody's calm, instead of in the aftermath of something really bad happening.
Yeah, no, we definitely don't hope something bad will happen. But I think the idea that there are different voices in government is normal. It's the same in the United States. It's cumbersome. Democracy can be. But if you look at sort of the tech companies, which we try to lumped together for the sake of this discussion. I can also give you a gazillion examples of where company A says one thing, company B says another thing, and we'll just have to navigate that. What I think is more important is that we focus the discussion, ideally actually in a sort of closer and more constructive dynamic between the private sector companies that are associated and incorporated in liberal democracies and democratic governments, about how we can actually solve for some of the key problems. What we've seen, and you mentioned they're now going to ask for regulation and call the bluff, but if that's the case, it is very new and it is a 180 turn, because for the longest time, companies have pushed back against regulation. So if that's now changing, okay, let's see what kind of opportunity that brings and what it signals at this moment in time that these companies are doing it. I believe that we should rather focus together on developing a liberal democratic governance model of technology vis-a-vis the more authoritarian, top-down, dictatorial kinds of systems that we see now developed in China, for example. And we are wasting a lot of time in the kind of back and forth between us, and we're trying to, or we're almost risking to not see that bigger picture.
So I find it like a false dichotomy to say it's just the tech companies and the governments will somehow figure out what's in the public interest, but the public will not be somehow involved. I almost feel like the institutions of civil society, like maybe even this forum, have a huge role to play, right? So because frankly, if I look at some of the folks in government in this country, I don't necessarily trust them. I don't think they are well educated. They might be persuaded by lobbies. And there have been lots of examples of lobbies getting to congressmen and getting things done that are not necessarily great. So I think there is a discussion to be had as to how can civil society play a role, what kind of institutions do we need. For example, the fact-checking infrastructure is an example of that, right? The third-party fact-checkers who sit between Facebook and the government, because we don't want the government telling Facebook what to get rid of, because they might have their own interests there. So I think it's important to have this third pillar of civil society that informs these discussions. It may be about community standards on what's acceptable and what's not. I don't want every citizen to get involved, but I think a certain representative segment needs to get involved. So I think that without that, especially in other countries where the governments are downright authoritarian, it's not going to work.
Mara.
If I can, push into this in more detail, to kind of think of this notion of when you think about, civil society, the public, government, and companies trying to make these choices together, one of the things I would kind of think of taking a technical perspective on it is companies want to optimize certain metrics, and there are certain metrics that they have like revenue generation, user engagement, minutes spent on platform, whatever the case may be. Those metrics get optimized relative to some constraints, and those constraints normally can be the laws. What does the government allow us to actually do? And within kind of thinking about that environment, if we think about, say, I want to maximize click-through rates, then I'm likely to create an echo chamber because I'm likely to show people what they would like to see. And that I can say has brought the public sphere in because it's using people's own voting power by clicking on certain things to say, this is what you wanted, so I'm going to give you more of it. But then we get into this notion of saying, okay, if the only constraints, say, for example, in the United States are the First Amendment, or in Europe or GDPR and some other issues around free speech, when we enter that gray area to say that we're not just saying anything that is allowed by the First Amendment is allowed on the platform, right? Twitter comes along and kicks off Alex Jones. Even though the stuff he says may be reprehensible, it's still protected by the First Amendment. We now get into this case where the constraints by which the company is supposed to act, if we think about that from a regulatory framework, is different than the constraints the government has imposed, right? So we're in this world where these arbitrary decisions get made. Is that the place that you're saying regulation needs to come in to create more of those constraints, or is it that gray area is where we should be operating? And the example I would give you is rather than, let's say, Mark Zuckerberg running Facebook, what if Donald Trump was running Facebook and decided that there was just some content he didn't like and it should be downranked? Right? That's within the constraints of what could happen in the law, but should he be allowed to do that?
Well, and I use that example a lot because I think when we think about the power of these companies, you have to grant them the power assuming that you do not like the people running them. And I think there's a lot of my friends with whom I politically agree with on the left, whom are very comfortable with the idea of Facebook having these powers because they assume they will only be used against the people they disagree with, right? And I always say part of that is because they know Mark Zuckerberg is a socially liberal millennial from Long Island, right? assume Mark decides, screw all this, I'm going to go live in Kauai, and Peter Thiel, the Austrian Ubermensch here from Stanford, takes over. What kind of powers do you want him to define what is acceptable speech? And I think in the most cases, people calling for more control of other people's speech, they would backtrack. And that's what you've got to, because maybe it's not actually Facebook, but the thing that's happening right now is we're setting norms that are going to exist for decades. The companies have almost unlimited legal capability to censor. CDA 230 both gives them liability protection from the content, but it also protects them from the people whose content they take down.
Can you give a little bit more background to the audience about CDA?
So CDA 230, Communications Decency Act Section 230, was part of this big bill that was actually meant to censor the internet. And there's big parts about how you could not have basically porn with a number of different kinds of definitions of stuff that's not allowed on the internet. But then to motivate the companies to go take that stuff down, there was a section that said you are not liable for content as long as you follow some other laws. You are not liable for content that's posted on your site if you're an intermediary, it's called. And then you are also protected from being sued if you take action to moderate your site. Most of the Communications Decency Act was struck down by the Supreme Court. CDA 230 survived. And so we ended up with, out of what was supposed to be actually a very controlling bill, out of kind of like the Newt Gingrich Congress, this very libertarian vision that gave the companies almost unlimited legal power to decide what is acceptable speech on their platforms. And so there's nothing very little in the United States restricting them from being absolute, tyrants on their platforms. Now, on smaller curated sites, maybe that's a fine thing. You want to be in this is something that's highly curated. I think as the companies get bigger and more powerful and kind of asymptotically approach monopoly, they have more of a responsibility to allow for more voices and to have a softer touch. And I think that's actually one of the weird ironies here is generally as companies get more powerful, historically we've treated them more like common carriers, not as if they have more of a responsibility to censor, but less. And that's one of the kind of weird ahistorical things that we're going through here, versus the telephone companies, right? But anyway, within that context, we've got to be really careful what norms we set, because the only thing restricting the companies right now are the norms that have been set about what is expected of them and what powers they have. And one norm that continues to survive is that Facebook should be politically neutral, right? And we just got to be really careful throwing away these norms because it won't always be these companies. 101 out here is lined with the bleached skulls of the tech companies that have come before, right? So you have to assume there will be different companies run by different people with different aspects. And so the norms and laws we set right now should be, I think, longer term than people are thinking. And so this is my just advice, especially for people who politically agree with me. When you're thinking about, I want this tech company to control the speech of somebody else, or I want to control their consumption of information. I want to restrict their ability to find something online or to consume something online. Think about if somebody you disagree with did that to you, would you want them to have that power? The crappy part of freedom is other people having it, right? You having freedom, easy. Other people having freedom, hard. But that's how it works, right? They got to have the freedom if you're going to have it too. And I think we've kind of lost that a bit. And I think Europe is, I'm going to give you the soft pitch. I think the Europeans especially are losing that, which is really sad. At the same time that European governments, a couple of them are going semi-fascist. They're creating powers that are going to be very, very dangerous in the hands of folks like the current Hungarian government.
So maybe just to put it in a slightly more extreme context. So Peter Thiel taking over is one thing. What about Alibaba buying Facebook tomorrow? How would the American people and all the users globally feel, right? So the idea that we can have sort of good faith expectations of a number of these companies, I think is not going to cut it. At least as a lawmaker, I don't consider whether I like a CEO or whether I trust them necessarily, because you want to draw one line that applies for everyone and that sets minimum standards. And I agree with you that those should be long-term and they should be anchored in law. But what I miss in a lot of these discussions is that there is extraordinary scrutiny of proposals that are being made to regulate or initial regulation that is taking place, and that we do not scrutinize with the same rigor the status quo. Because under the First Amendment, these private companies already have the power to decide. If they don't want to ever report about sports anymore, they can do it, no problem. Even though reporting about sports is perfectly legal and perhaps even uncontroversial, depending on who's playing who. But the idea that they are not already making a number of decisions that are not anchored in law, I think, needs to be taken into account. And the fact that they have the freedom to make decisions on things that are quite blatant, like encouraging children to take a big risk, or the sharing of bullying videos, or this anti-vaccination. The reason why companies are reluctant to take those actions is because it would creep into the direction of liability. So this exemption of liability, the Section 230 in your law, is so vital for their business models that they do not want to proactively show that they're able to moderate content, to have an editorial role, because once it is shown in one case, something extreme, then it can creep into other areas, and then this whole exemption of liability would sort of be non-credible or effectively not lived up to. And I think that that is where the tension comes from. But can companies already make decisions like banning accounts from Alex Jones, right?
Yeah.
Or people like that? They can. I mean, if they want to throw me off tomorrow and I violate their terms of use, they can. And I think they could probably kick me off even if I don't violate them.
Yeah, they don't need a legal basis.
So it's completely into private governance hands. And I think we are approaching these companies, and that I think that this discussion shows that, with the expectations that we have of governments. And if that's the expectation that we have of these very powerful companies, and you've called it quasi-governments in the kind of role that they have.
Now that I'm academic, I try to use Latin and Greek to sound smarter, but I'm not fooling anybody.
No, but I do think that the idea that they have extraordinary power, and the notion that there are expectations of fairness, of redress, of checks and balances, of a sense of justice, of buy-in from the constituents. I mean, all these elements that we know so well from democracy are not translated in governance models. So if we think that these companies are so powerful that they have a significant impact on the public debate, on democracy, on competition, on public health, on discrimination or non-discrimination, then we have to be much more rigorous in how we're going to safeguard some standards.
So picking up on
Is that an argument for more or less?
I wanted to respond to
You
that.
made both arguments. That's my problem, right? Do you think they should do more, be more aggressive about living up to their civic responsibility?
Yes.
Or should they be more hands-off?
No, I think these companies should be more responsible towards their civic responsibility, but we should set minimum standards in law and regulation, meaning we could identify principles and give regulators, so not governments, depending on which political side, but sort of in Europe at least, regulators like telecom regulators, competition regulators, they're independent. They're not politically appointed. They act like an extension of the judiciary. They assess whether a law is complied with. I think here the tension comes from the fact that regulators also set the standards, and they're often politically appointed, which makes them more, leaning one way or another, like the FTC or the FCC, et cetera. So maybe that's something that needs to be rethought. But the point is, why can't Facebook as a company or YouTube as a company not be part of common sense assessment of how its products are working, and if it turns out that there are deadly consequences, take the freedom that they have to act responsibly?
So they do every day. The irony here is if you call for them to make more decisions on their own of what is in the civic best interest, it creates a bigger distance between them and democratic accountability, right? Because governments aren't making those decisions, they are. And that's, I think, I'm not even sure what we're arguing about at this point, but we're pretty deep into it. But I feel like the companies are making those decisions, but we need to have some kind of animating idea of what should motivate them and what limits they should have. And I think the best thing is they should do this themselves.
Exactly.
One of the biggest problems that the companies have is that they make these decisions in secret. So if you're interested in this area, I strongly recommend this article that was just in Vanity Fair. It was about a single decision that Facebook had to make, a content moderation decision that turns out to be super complicated, and they let this reporter sit in for the conversation, which the question is there was a group on Facebook that was called Men Are Scum, and it was just full of women posting things about men. Is that hate speech? The term men are scum. And when you start to kind of like diagram the sentence out, and you try to come up with a rule that will cover all of the different eventualities, you start to decide, is men a gender? Is it a sexuality? Is it part of a innate biological, or is it an identity that you can take yourself? What is scum? Is scum like, what do you mean by scum? It's an incredibly complicated thing. And the problem is that these decisions happen every single day inside the companies, and with this one exception of a Vanity Fair reporter being there, they're all secret. And so all that happens, in the end, in this case, they left men as scummers up. But then maybe they take down men are really scum, and all those people are super angry that they were taken down, and it seems capricious and arbitrary, and they don't realize that 10 JDs, and it's not engineers making these decisions, these are all like people with fancy liberal arts degrees and mostly lawyers, 10 of them sitting around a table yelled about this for 8 hours before making a decision. When we do that in the legal system, people write that down and you can read about it, right? And I think that is one of the things that have to happen, is the decisions have to be on the outside a bit. But the flip side is then if people don't like that and they don't like the decisions, then governments are going to have to take responsibility. And there's a little bit, and this is happening in Europe as well, where the governments want the companies to do things but don't want to be responsible for any of the downside. In Germany, they passed this law called NetzDG that strongly encouraged the companies to enforce German hate speech law with all of the penalties on if you missed taking down something, and no penalties for over-censoring. And so what do you think is going to happen, right? Like, these companies are only penalized on one side, they massively over-censor. And now the government, whenever this happens, when some comedian's taken down, that everybody agrees this should be okay, the government's like, oh, it wasn't our fault, it was Facebook, right? And they're trying to create like having it both ways of like, we want all the censorship, but we want you to take the blame for it. I think that's cowardly. I think if the company should come out and say, these are our standards, these are our principles, this is how we make the decisions, but then governments are going to have to say, yes, that's reasonable, or no, and then take the actual responsibility for adjudicating it, and then taking the heat from their own citizens, instead of trying to create a situation that is perhaps in some cases not even allowed by their law, right, or goes well beyond what they are legally authorized to do through yelling at these companies, which in one case, and that I was really angry about in the UK, a minister of parliament in the UK wrote to Facebook threatening Facebook with regulation if they didn't take down this one specific guy's account, which I think is completely inappropriate.
No, that's terrible.
For a democratically elected leader, you know what you call in a democracy a system that weighs people's various rights and comes up with a decision of whose rights win? That's called a court system, right? Like, the members of parliament should not be threatening, take down my political enemy or you'll be regulated.
No, that's preposterous.
Right.
But I think
You would
that
never
this
do that.
notion. No, but you've brought me to an interesting idea. No, just kidding. No, I wouldn't do that. But I just very briefly, because
My account. That's it. You're
No,
right,
not at all, not at all. I'm a big believer in freedom of expression, but I think that this is what needs to happen much more, an engagement in this discussion, because this debate tends to be, what should be banned and what should be regulated, but more engagement from tech companies about their decisions, and also being open to pushback, because this is how you get to a better place. You try something with best effort, you get feedback, you reevaluate, you reiterate, you move on. I mean, that's also the way that laws are often made. But we cannot simply reduce this to a discussion of, what law should govern what. And by the way, these companies are, as you mentioned, global. They reach a lot of people that are outside of US jurisdiction, outside of European jurisdiction. So even if you wanted to regulate everything, it's going to be incredibly difficult. And that's why it's very important that these companies make their own values decisions and be transparent about it.
Krishna, I want to get you into the conversation and then over to Hillary.
Finally, okay. I think, a lot of this has focused on, I'm blanking out finally. Gosh. Go ahead.
If Alex says something, it'll come right back.
I mean, so
Hillary,
I'll
you
say
first.
I'm experiencing a similar phenomenon where my questions are evolving in real time in response to the conversation as it's unfolding.
Sorry,
But
let me-
Got it.
Okay,
See,
go.
I knew it.
So before the nightmare scenarios of somebody truly evil takes over these companies, or if foreign government acquires it, I think we have a window while these companies, at least on the surface, in terms of what they're saying, like, do the right things, says Google. And if you hear what Mark is saying, he's saying, I'm trying to do the right thing too. So while that window exists, we have an opportunity to say, what is it that is going to prevent this future scenario when somebody else takes over, right? So at the moment, these companies have employees of all political persuasions. They have product decisions that are probably getting logged. There's probably code that's getting checked in that is auditable. So even creating sort of a culture inside the company where stuff that's going going into the code, the product decisions that are being made are being documented and at least are subject to some internal scrutiny, potentially also external scrutiny over time, might create the kind of culture and norms that will later protect us when something bad happens, right?
Yeah, Hillary.
So, I mean, picking up on some of the comments that were brought up earlier. So part of this thought exercise of, imagine if Mark Zuckerberg were the person you least agreed with politically, which Donald Trump for me is a pretty good option there. I mean, or maybe Alibaba.
But you have to imagine they're competent because you have to be afraid of their power.
Fair, even better, a competent, but somebody with whom I disagree. I mean, part of what it makes me realize is, A, it's great when you happen to be in political agreement with a powerful person, but B, I actually don't want anybody to have that much power certainly not in that kind of position. This is an argument that's often made about executive power in government, why you want to have checks on different branches because you don't want one person to have that much power. And that's, what I'm thinking about with respect to a CEO of a private company, certainly. So I want to talk a little bit about the tools that we actually have, whether as lawmakers or as citizens and perhaps as civil society members, to check that power. And one of the tools that's been brought up is antitrust, which has some real strengths, but also has some real limitations. So I want you to help us understand, what can antitrust efforts get us in this conversation about checking the power of ungovernable platforms, and what problems will it actually introduce that we should anticipate if we're trying to use that as a tool? We can start with Marita, given that the EU has sort of led the charge in antitrust, but then Alex, I want to open it up to you, hearing sort of from the company's perspective.
Yeah, so I think it's important to keep in mind the origins of antitrust and competition law, which is to enable fair competition and a healthy marketplace. So the idea of free markets is also fair markets, and that's where antitrust law often comes in. But it also, in Europe at least, pertains to things like mergers and acquisitions. So what if there are 4 companies in the market, 2 of them want to merge? Will they acquire significant market power that I mentioned before, leading to all kinds of risks in terms of the competition that's left and the power that they have? And I think there's more and more assessment of how to weigh the value of data, not so much only stock market value or amount of customers, but to really also look in assessing mergers and competition and antitrust, the way in which data is being dealt with. Now, normally in Europe, antitrust is investigated, or competition violations are investigated on the basis of a complaint. So there might be someone with a search engine suggesting that another search engine has not respected competition laws, and then the European Commission can investigate, and if they find wrongdoing, they can impose a fine. And this is not only for tech companies, this is for oil companies, truck companies. Any company can be subject to this from anywhere in the world operating in Europe. So the possibility would exist to assess whether there are monopolies forming and whether there needs to be action against monopoly forming, which I hear more and more voices calling for here in the United States as well. So you could deal with the notion of too big to fail, too big to allow for any innovation in the same sphere to come from smaller competitors. So that, could it solve a problem if you think that those are the problems? On the other hand, it would take a long time. And it would be kind of like a blunt hammer for addressing specific elements, perhaps, where we just talked about various sort of problems that some of these tech companies bring forward. And I don't think that competition in and of itself can solve all of those problems.
Can I press this just one degree further?
Sorry,
Go ahead,
I agree with you. It's impossible to build a Google today. It's impossible to build a Facebook today, because the data strength they have by virtue of the social graph or by virtue of the billions of queries they get is something no startup can possibly compete with. Mm-hmm. And I think the notion that we as users are giving this data freely and sort of fueling this monopoly is the challenge, right? I think ultimately, if there was a way to make that available more generally to other companies who might want to come up, there would be competition. Mm-hmm. But there cannot be competition unless that data that they are privileged is also shared more broadly.
All right, so one approach is to try to attack the data advantage that large companies have. I'll just offer another possibility, which is acknowledging this mergers and acquisitions dynamic that's also true about large tech companies. So it's hard to imagine Google enjoys something like a 90% market share in its search functionality, but of course it has a blizzard of other products as well, YouTube among lots of others. Facebook enjoys 2.5 billion people using the Facebook platform, but it also has WhatsApp and Instagram. So it's unclear to me what antitrust would mean with respect to the search function of Google. What would it mean to break up the Google search monopoly with 90% market share? But it's easy to imagine what it would mean to say Google can't own YouTube as well. It's easy to imagine what Facebook could do by saying you don't get to acquire WhatsApp and Instagram. Would that be a good approach? So the data concentration is hard to get at, but the acquisition tendency that any modestly threatening competitor can get purchased and absorbed into the same company, that's what to ward against.
I think that's the right approach. I mean, first, people throw out antitrust as this magic solution to every problem. And so you'll hear people on the Alex Jones fans and the neo-Nazis say, we're being censored by companies that are too big and powerful. We need antitrust. And then you'll hear progressives, these companies are too big, they're not doing enough content moderation, antitrust. They can't both be right? And I think they're both wrong in that the truth is antitrust is competition policy. The focus should be on creating a competitive marketplace. You're not going to get what you want out of content moderation, what you want out of privacy, all of these 90% of the things that people say I can fix with antitrust, they can't. But what you can do is create a competitive marketplace. And the best way to create a competitive marketplace is bring us back to the place that I was talking about of all of the dead companies on 101, right? So the Facebook main campus, that famous thumbs up sign, if you go around and walk to the back, it's the Sun Microsystems logo that used to belong to Sun Microsystems. And Mark Zuckerberg intentionally did not have the back painted because he wanted to remind the employees of that company that they were working within the bones of a dinosaur that had come and died before, right? That anybody can be overturned. But the reason they're not being is that one, I think the biggest thing is the M&A, is that the big public companies have a lot of data. They're very good at spotting who is important. And so they make these decisions that seem insane to Wall Street, and then everybody thinks it's fantastic afterwards. Mark bought Instagram for $1 billion. People are like, he's insane. We need to have a shareholder revolt. That company's probably worth $150, $200 billion by itself now. Mark bought WhatsApp for $20 billion. People are like, this is an insane waste of taxpayer, of shareholder value. Now everybody thinks that was a genius idea. And so I think stopping the ability for the companies, Google and YouTube, for the companies to take their competitors out using their public company valuations, their public market valuations, is a totally appropriate thing and probably doesn't require any more laws, probably just requires more aggressive enforcement by FTC, DOJ, and EU. I think the other thing is then to focus on, if you're gonna create new laws to regulate tech, to really, really think and game out, what do these mean for startups? And the truth is most of the regulation that has been passed in the last couple of years has been fantastic for the big American incumbents. GDPR is wonderful for Facebook. It is wonderful for some technical reasons, that Facebook runs their own ads. But it's mostly wonderful because nobody knows what it means. GDPR is interpreted by 28 different data protection authorities in 28 sovereign states. There will be actions against Facebook and Google and other companies in 28 different places. There will be lawsuits over the next 10 years. Facebook can afford to have a lawyer in every single one of those cities and to have people interpret the law for them and help them stay competitive. A 20-person German startup that wants to compete against Facebook cannot afford that, right? And so they are in this massive gray area of not knowing whether they're compliant and possibly have a competitor of theirs take them out. And so if we're gonna pass laws, we should be very careful to think about what do these do to startups? Because in the long run, creating a huge amount of regulatory, this is just exactly what happened in the United States with Starbucks. We thought we were regulating the big banks. We created a market where only big banks can survive. We do not want to create a market where only big tech can survive and everybody else gets squashed. That doesn't mean no regulation. It just means being smart about doing things like having safe harbors, having minimum sizes for companies before you enforce, being really clear about your guidance so people can make decisions without hiring lawyers. Lots of companies, the moment they've called a lawyer, they're out of money, right? That's the kind of thing that regulators need to think about.
So I just wanted to come back to the antitrust because I think it's an important point you're making. Just because something is called Google Search or Google News or another function of Google Calendar or whatnot doesn't mean that they're different companies. The question is how the data is used and how it's merged and what their sort of ownership is. So I think, even if you're selling trucks and you're opening 20 different stores, but you all own the trucks and you determine the pricing, and there's, then it doesn't matter if you have 20 storefronts or one, let's say. So I think that that's important to note. And then I'm sure Alex will be happy to hear that antitrust law has been operating from a European level, so it applies to the entire single market, and it has not been created for tech companies, which is sometimes a perception, especially here in Silicon Valley, that among others, Europe is sort of creating law after law after law to go after the big successful American tech companies. And competition has really been one of those actually uncontroversial, independently assessed laws that has really also withstood a lot of political storm, I would say. And it also means that the competition commissioner, which is a Danish woman by the name of Margrethe Vestager, she really has to keep a very clear eye, and recently made a lot of enemies in Europe by not allowing for the merger between two big rail companies who wanted to create one European champion against China, quote unquote, and she just didn't see reason for allowing that merger to happen. So this is kind of policy that is done on the basis of very clear principles, irrespective of what case, and I hope it can stay that way, because if competition law is going to be seen as instrumentalized to deal with tech, I think it will really lose a lot of its credibility and power as a result.
Can I ask a quick follow-up related to antitrust, which is, we've kind of gone down this path before, right? So in the late 60s, early 70s, this large antitrust case was brought against IBM, lasted for 25 years, didn't result in anything. Large antitrust case brought in the late 90s against Microsoft, should be broken up into operating systems, applications. Those should be separate. They're clearly different kinds of things. Didn't lead anywhere, right? And the whole argument that was made is that there's more competition. There's always going to be competition, right? Sun Microsystems dies, Facebook moves in. Maybe 20 years from now, Facebook dies, someone else moves in. I'm wondering if whether or not you think, even if someone were to bring the antitrust hammer against these large companies, whether or not there's actually any chance of success of that, if there's a model that you think will lead to a real change.
There is already a model. There's one model. And it is a case-by-case assessment of whether the laws are being respected, and the consequence is a fine oftentimes. And you can also wonder whether it hurts the big companies. I think that's a legitimate question, whether the fines are proportionate and therefore heavy-handed enough. But I'm not sure. I mean, maybe we should ask someone who knows Microsoft better, but I've heard from a lot of people who've looked at that case that it has had an impact on Microsoft, and that it had a deterring impact on what they wanted to do, that they've had a record fine at the time for their practices. They survived, but they're a different company now. So I don't know. I mean, you never have sort of the alternative case because there's only one outcome. But
neither Microsoft nor IBM had a data advantage, that without that data you can't get in the game. Right? So over time, there were other competitors who just built better products. So I feel like the social graph and the search history are incredibly, incredibly powerful, and they will not be replicated. And you can find all you want, but
no, and
therefore
we have to look broadly at what needs to be done. So for example, one of the things could be the use of data for micro-targeting. So can you use the data that you have and combine it in all sorts of ways to address people in a very detailed way with your ads, right? I think that that's a question that is going to rise. Maybe some categories are going to be struck out so that you don't have also this perpetual collection of data, because then you have more targeted ads, people will click on it more, it's like a circular kind of process. So we should never think about one solution only. There is no magic wand. It's going to be complicated, and different outcomes have to be addressed with different tools.
So when
Alex, and then over to Jeremy.
So when I look at the Microsoft case, I think what you should look at is not what was the effect on Microsoft, but whether the case was relevant in the marketplace. So the Microsoft case was focused on whether Microsoft was using their near monopoly in desktop operating systems to benefit software that was bundled with it. And one of the outcomes was they had to give choice for things like web browsers. While this fight is going on, we end up in a world now where this phone has hardware-based DRM, digital rights management, that restricts all the code in here has to be signed by Apple, and you are not allowed to change out any of the default apps, including the web browser, because Apple will not allow you to, and nobody talks about it, because the entire marketplace, this is the absolute worst nightmare. When people thought about Microsoft in the 1990s, Apple has gone well past like the most evil predictions of what Bill Gates would possibly do. Apple has done, but people don't worry about it because the structure of the overall market has changed, and the antitrust work was completely irrelevant. So I think you're totally right. It's the M&A thing, like create competition. Get lots of companies in here. Don't let the big companies squash them. Don't let the big companies take them off the board by buying them. And you will naturally end up with I think, a better equilibrium. The problem with I agree with the data stuff. The problem there is Facebook used to have a mechanism for people to share their social graph. It was called the Graph API. You might have heard of this little company in Cambridge, United Kingdom, called Cambridge Analytica that really loved the Graph API. Thanks to everybody's massive freak out about Cambridge Analytica, Facebook will never again have to open up the social graph. And so there was another hard engineering trade-off. Openness or data safety and data security can't have both of those. Either people can take their graphs with them, or their data is in the walled garden and is protected. And this wasn't like a legally decided thing, but the overall public reaction to one specific breach of that has pushed that all the way to one direction, and no company again will be dumb enough to allow for that kind of openness. Jeremy.
So I want to invite people to stand up by the mics. I see one on this side. I don't quite see one. Is there one?
There's a mic over here too.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
There's one here.
Just over there, and we'll turn to questions from the audience in just a minute. But if I can take us in a slightly different direction than antitrust, and I'm just going to throw my cards on the table about something that I'm concerned about, which is I'm concerned about the breakdown in journalism, given that journalism is a key accountability mechanism in our democracies. And I think if we care about liberal democracy and its preservation, we have to deal with the fact that the shift in the direction of many-to-many communication that we've gotten with the platforms, the wide diversity of sources that people can tap into, has come at the expense potentially of a business model that enabled our journalistic entities to invest in the kind of accountability journalism that we need to make our democracy work. And this gets at your point related to civil society. There's also fake news on top of that. There are filter bubbles, there are echo chambers, and all these other things which you may, and we had this conversation earlier today, Alex, you may believe that these are things that sort of are characteristic of society and they're just amplified potentially on the platforms. But nonetheless, we're at a moment where the very viability of our democratic institutions and the survivability of our institutions, I think, are a real and salient concern in a way that they haven't been in the past. Do you agree with that sort of laying of the cards on the table? Are you also concerned about truth and journalism and our ability to, from the outside of government and the outside of companies, to sort of have checks in society that come from this kind of truth-telling and the reasoned debate around a common set of facts that are central to democratic deliberation? And if so, what do we do about that?
I agree with almost everything you say, but I think this problem predates the platforms, right? Before the platforms we have today existed, there was the internet, right? Before that, you had relatively few publishers. Those publishers had massive audiences that had built up over the last century. And at that point, because of the size of the audience and the fact that they had access to classifieds and advertising, they could monetize that audience, and they had, in some cases, total power over a city or whatever, right? Along comes the internet, and it's not just the audience that's massive, but the publisher ecosystem is also massive, and it's much more efficient to do your classifieds elsewhere, and your advertising networks move off, and suddenly you're left with these publishers who don't have an economic model to sustain it. That is the core of the problem. So there are two problems in what you articulated. One is, how do you sustain, how hard news and good journalism? And how do you also, deal with the fact that there's a lot of misinformation on top of it? These are very hard problems. They're not trivial to solve. They kind of happen regardless of whether the platforms existed or not, but maybe they are getting worse because of the alternative places we can go and get content. In particular, you can get, on WhatsApp, you can get content as a meme, right? Like it doesn't have to come from any source. You can get, and a lot of that can be actually fake. So I think the only way to, there is going to be a certain amount of consolidation, and some of these sources are going to get bigger before things get, before they become economically viable. But still, there are really hard questions. How are you going to finance the kinds of investigative journalism we need, especially at the local level, where there really aren't enough subscribers? And I think at some level, either government sponsorship or some kind of patronage model has to come in to help this, because I don't see any other way to pay for it.
Yeah, I mean,
Please.
okay. So I think that a lot has to do with the fact that all the advertisement revenue has been concentrated, so it links back to this question of monopolies, competition, et cetera. But I also want to nuance it a little bit because I see a mixed bag. I have concern about the lack of shared debates about shared information, in the sense that, my mother's generation, they would watch the 6 o'clock news or the 8 o'clock news, or they would read the weekend paper, and a significant amount of people would see similar main stories and would talk about it at the baker, at the birthday party, at the street corner. I think now, because of this notion of filter bubbles or automatically recommended information, there is more fragmentation. And I think also there is crowding out of news by entertainment a lot. And I think we don't talk about that enough. The idea that people like the Kardashians have more followers than any public figure, et cetera, says a little bit about where young people's minds are drawn to. I don't want to oversimplify, but just touch on this issue of competition with entertainment, and maybe exemplified by your current president, what entertainment mixed with current affairs can lead to.
What do you mean? I don't.
Well, sort of reality show figure becoming president.
Okay, it's
Never happened.
No, but on the optimistic side, really, I mean, I also see a lot of very interesting new initiatives. One, I think the podcast as a phenomenon for longer listening, often uninterrupted, longer conversations, long reads, blogs, products like Medium, Blendle, The Correspondent, which is a crowdsourced membership investigative journalism platform that originated in the Netherlands but is now also coming to the United States, are all developments to watch as well, which would have been impossible without both sort of the platform type technologies and the widespread internet access and access to mobile devices. So what we have to guard for, and I think public resources should be dedicated to that, is a pluriform media landscape and also local media. I think the cutting out of local media has been very costly for oversight on local government, and I would hope that there could be public resources dedicated to that. And similarly to foreign language media services, it's really ironic that in the years that the Dutch, the French, the German, the American, the British government were cutting resources from foreign language media services, that the Russians and the Chinese were actually increasing their resources, and we can all see the consequences of that. So again, before stepping in, let's look at the landscape, let's look at where the vacuums are. Are those vacuums that jeopardize the public interest? If so, let's dedicate public resources, but let's also celebrate what's going well.
I agree, it's a huge problem, and I think one of the factors that really scares me is we're getting this bifurcation of good media costs money and crap is free. Right? If you look at the top 10 news sites on Facebook, they're all junk. It's because it's all free. And I can pay for a New York Times subscription and a Washington Post subscription, but most people won't. And so the Times is fine, the Post is fine, because they have a large enough audience. But the vast majority of local media will not be able to support themselves with that. And I think this has actually been a huge missed opportunity for the big tech companies to solve this, because movies and music went through the same problem of get rid of the gatekeepers, lots of people, everybody wants something free, very hard to sell lots and lots of subscriptions, and the solution was the services. And some people have estimated that people spend way more money when they have a Netflix subscription and a Spotify subscription. They're spending more money on music, more money on movies, but they're willing to do it because it lowers the friction and it's so incredibly convenient. But none of the tech companies have stepped forward and done that for local news. You can't do it for the New York Times or wherever. They can demand their $20 a month, but for the Sacramento Bee and the Las Vegas Review-Journal and the local paper in Brussels, you could come up with a solution where you pay $30 a month and all of them get divvied out a little bit of money every single time. A number of small companies are trying this. They don't have the scale. Really, only a Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, maybe, probably not Apple, because their devices are only used by rich people, and you need to get to all kinds of people. So those companies could try a solution here, and none of them have. And I think part of it is they're so afraid, they're so burned from touching the media and then doing a poor job and being punished that they're not willing to try again. And I think that's not the right solution. The solution is to go try again and keep on trying until they find a solution that works.
All right, we're going to go to the audience questions. Before the night ends, we want to make sure we get the panelists to offer some comments on the announcement that Mark Zuckerberg made today about the move towards privacy and changing social networking itself. But let's get a couple questions in, please.
Hi, my name is Vaishnavi, and I've really appreciated this conversation. It's one of the best ones I've heard so far in this series, and I think part of that is
how better? Are we the best?
I would say
I don't want to just be we're kind of good.
Top 10.
Top 10 of 5? Wow. Next question, sir, in the Italian, yeah.
And I think the reason it's been so interesting is because precisely we've had this discussion between representatives of governments as well as representatives of private corporations. And it leads me to some of the big question I have, which is there's been a lot of discussion today around norm setting and what are the norms by which we're going to design our products and design our companies and design our laws. But while it's great that the US and Europe are represented here, there are a vast diversity of countries, my own included, that are not represented here, which have vastly differing social norms. And so I'm curious to hear from the perspective of someone who's a member of a supranational body like the European Parliament, as well as people who work, who have worked at companies that cater to really diverse populations around the world, what you think about some of these decisions being up-leveled to multi-stakeholder institutions, groups like the United Nations or international governing bodies. And one of the arguments that can be made there is we want civil society to be involved, we want governments to be involved, we want corporations to be involved. These institutions have a history of engaging with a vast variety of stakeholders and coming up with conventions or treaties, many of which we have signed on to, many of our countries have signed on to. What are your thoughts on the merits of such a solution, the drawbacks, the practicality? Is that something that could ever happen? I'd love to know what you think.
Mm-hmm. So I think your point is very important, that we should always think about the possible impact beyond borders and also be inclusive in decision-making processes, think about all the billions that are not online yet, instead of talking only about those who are wealthy enough and connected enough already. But then to think about sort of global norm setting, the United Nations, I'm afraid that the differences between governments at this moment in time and the way in which the United Nations works are not leading to very fruitful outcomes, and I'm being diplomatic. And it's unfortunate because while technology is connecting the world, we see a sort of re-manifestation of nationalism in many parts of the world, and attempts by governments to sort of cut up the internet, to fragment the open internet, which I think will really jeopardize many of the best potential of our technological revolution. So you also mentioned the idea of getting around the table with multiple stakeholders, civil society being very important, governments, private sector, et cetera. And I think that is a good model, but it is not a magic solution in and of itself. And the answer too many questions cannot just be multi-stakeholderism. For the people who deal with internet governance discussions, I think you know what I'm talking about. If it is not clear which stakeholder brings which weight and which responsibility to the table and therefore is willing to accept which accountability, because it's really hard to compare multi-billion-dollar company with one person at the table and a small, NGO dealing with women's safety online, for example, and to say, well, all the stakeholders were at the table. I mean, what does it mean? So we need to give more meaning to those processes, and then I think something can be done. I'm myself involved in a number of multi-stakeholder initiatives that seek to establish norms as a suggestion that then others can pick up, which have really been thought through by different experts in an attempt to bring minds together in viable concepts. But it's hard work, but it's very urgent. So I'm glad that you asked the question.
So when you
I agree with you. I think there is no alternative at some level. I think it's easier to start at the most objective kinds of things for which we can design norms, like fact-checking, right? I mean, there's already a fair bit of collaboration between the tech platforms and, especially around elections and whatnot. I think if you go all the way to like what is indecent and not, that's going to vary tremendously, and that's not even practical. So there's going to be a certain number of additional things you can layer on top of it. But I'm also extremely skeptical, like given how the United Nations works and whether it'll have teeth. But I think you got to start somewhere. At least getting the platforms to say we're going to build norms together involving civil society would be a great first step. And so fighting fake news is one thing, and then going beyond that would be nice.
So if I may guess, are you talking about India when you talk about your? No. It's actually thinking about
Singapore.
Okay. Yes. So I'm going to talk about India instead. Singapore is interesting, but Singapore's kind of got its act together and knows what it wants, right? I think India is by far the most interesting regulator of the internet for the next 10 years, right? So they are so economically important, especially the tech companies that are locked out of China, which is mostly Google and all of Facebook. You can't be locked out of China and India and consider yourself like a 21st century country, right? And so India has the economic wherewithal to enforce its rules on the tech companies, which Russia, for example, does not. So that makes it incredibly important. India does not have the kind of protection for individual rights and free speech that we enjoy in North America and in Western Europe. In fact, India, some years, is the #1 requester of censorship on Facebook and other platforms because they have blasphemy laws, they have very strong laws against defamation. There's a lot of things you can get content taken down in India. They have a massive problem with violence that is spread by rumors. That violence is being spread on WhatsApp. WhatsApp has no algorithmic ranking. WhatsApp is communications that is sent to you by your friends and family members. So the existence of this problem kind of puts a lie to some of the other stuff about it's all about the algorithm. No, it's not. It's about the emergent human behavior of how humans want to use these systems. WhatsApp has difficulty solving this problem because they encrypt all their messages. So they have decided to give 500 million Indians complete privacy from Facebook and from the US government and from the Indian government, but the flip side is they cannot stop violence. And the government is complaining about violence on WhatsApp, while the BJP, the current ruling party, is also running at least one warehouse of people who are sending fake messages that are trying to spur up violence against Muslims. So it is a fascinating, incredibly complicated country, and what happens in India is going to be really, really important as India looks at the American system, the Wild West, but we're making a ton of money. The European system, highly controlled, but of the top 20 internet companies by revenue, only 2 of them are European. That'll be one after Brexit, Spotify. So Europe's not really making money off of the internet like anybody else. China, making money, economic growth, but huge totalitarian control. India is going to try to pick and choose from these models, and what they choose will become a model for Brazil, for Indonesians, for sub-Saharan Africa. They will set the standard for what is allowable and not, and I think it is a massively undercovered story and something that we in the West are not paying enough attention to because India is a very complicated place.
Next question.
Thank you. I'm Raj. I think here I'll go by the title, whatever it says, Power of Private Platforms. Just only thing I would like to add here is along with the government. So power of platforms, they have one party in India, I just want to quote it out. They used Google Doc as a medium to distribute what content to distribute. They used when to distribute, using the Google Doc to define the timing, and they use Facebook and Twitter to post the messages, what they want to communicate, and use Cambridge Analytica to analyze who to target, and use phone number to match with Facebook to analyze the people's profile so that they can be targeted if they are to manipulate the voting system. So the question, and WhatsApp is another method to distribute too. So now Mark Zuckerberg is planning to consolidate all the messaging platforms. So that's even going to get even worse. So my question is, why we are allowing all the political parties to run on private platforms, and what is the regulatory body is failing to stop using private platforms to manipulate people's vote and polarizing people. There is a TED Talks about automating the politician. Should we go towards that model where we can get rid of all these politicians and focus on artificial intelligence and focus on?
Wow.
So that's the
That's a disruptive technology.
You got to be taxi drivers first, but first it's the European Parliament.
So
Get
if
on
we
it.
can get rid of the first person who is causing the problem, then we can subsequently solve all the other problems. Just want to hear from the public and the private side. The reason why I said the power of platforms is we talked about so far only one platform, but combining these platforms together with the governing political parties, it's a dangerous trend which is getting set, not just in India, it's going to get transferred to other parts of the world. Just wanted to share your thoughts, please. Thank you.
Anyone want to weigh in? So not Russian interference on the platform, but the governing party interference to maintain power on the platform across a unified messaging system that's end-to-end encrypted.
Right, which is way more common problem than the Russians. Like, while we've been focused on foreign interference, the truth is the vast majority of inauthentic political interference and information operations are conducted by governments and by private actors within countries against their own citizens. This makes sense. It is actually quite difficult for the Russians to fill a whole building full of people who speak well enough English to pretend to be Americans in Texas and then also pay them nothing, right? But if you're within one of these countries and you have a activated group, so like that BJP problem in India, they don't pay these people. They've got like 1 million people who are basically signed up to be part of like politically active and who will forward these messages on their behalf. And so it is a massive problem. I think there's not a lot you can do about the actual messaging, because if they're able to get hundreds of thousands of people to do something, they can do that no matter what. What we do need to focus on is the advertising, because the advertising is where you can have the hyper-targeting. And I totally agree. I think we need to have standards that take the ability to hyper-target ads out of the hands of politicians. I would love to see a standard between the United States and Europe. Because if the US and Europe came up with like, this is a definition of what a political ad is, and this is how we want to restrict targeting, then that would become a worldwide standard pretty quickly. But we've got to do that now in the United States, because right now, billionaires are gunning up for the 2020 election. Mike Bloomberg announced that he's going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a data operation targeting Donald Trump. Even if you agree with that goal, which I do, that should still be terrifying. That it's like, our billionaires are better than your billionaires, so we're going to win. We got to stop that and have disarmament of both sides, and the only way to do that is with the law.
Let's talk.
I'm so glad to hear this. This was really music to my ears. But I think you're absolutely right. Also, the notion that money plays such an extraordinary role here in politics, and that the tech platforms have really amplified that. Because even if the platforms themselves and the algorithms are 100% neutral, still the more money you pay, the more people you can reach. And we have a profoundly different system in most European countries, even though there's no transparency about party funding, and we have the same problems with micro-targeted advertisement. But I think another point that you made, or at least that I thought you were making, is about where politicians broadcast official messages. I think there too, there's a tendency to do a live stream on Facebook, or to go to a platform instead of doing a publicly available website. And I think that too could be a very simple agreement that political parties and politicians make together, that they will share their information in a public space, like the website of a political party or a blog of sorts, and that they also take responsibility not to use hacked, stolen, doxed information, not to use deep fakes against opponents. I've worked on a pledge across the Atlantic, which is always nice, where we ask political parties and candidates to sign up to certain kind of behavior, which also includes educating campaign staff, for example, because there's also a market of sort of very perverse incentives, kind of practices that we saw here in Alabama. Maybe you've read about it, candidate that was using Kremlin-esque tactics to beat the opponent. And after, I think, the Washington Post investigated this story, everybody's pointing to everyone. So the candidate says, I had a campaign team says, well, we hired a consultant says, well, I don't know, ask the donors. And at the end of the day, nobody knows, but fake accounts were created, misinformation was shared, and that also is eroding democracy. And if that's happening in our societies, I totally agree we have to be extra mindful when hate speech, incitement of violence is shared, whether it's on a public or a private platform. I've seen it firsthand in Kenya, where I was leading the election observation mission, where people were sending pictures of dead bodies in closed chat groups, messenger groups, and it really led to real-life action, even though the pictures came from another country, another year, and had nothing to do with the election that was at hand. So it's very, very dangerous.
So the upcoming Indian election is going to be really scary because, as you mentioned, the BJP has got, for example, they have 2 WhatsApp groups for every polling place that is going to be responsible for local distribution. You don't even have to do micro-targeting. Those people know how to customize those messages, right? So you don't need extra data. And so memes are going to be spread in advance of the election that is going to end up influencing. And we don't know nobody's responsible because none of this is visible, right? It's all opaque. And I think that is the big concern I have as Zuck moves ahead with his, all of my properties are going to be completely opaque, is that there's going to be zero accountability. If it's happening there, it's going to happen here. And we're going to have this replay of the 2016 election, except with no auditing.
Good, that's where I wanted to go. So the Zuckerberg announcement, for any of you in the room who haven't seen it, is that next week we have Brian Acton coming, the co-founder of WhatsApp. And so the approach that WhatsApp pioneered, this end-to-end, fully encrypted communication, which then Zuckerberg bought and Facebook owns, but in what continued in this end-to-end encrypted way, Zuckerberg has announced that he's going to now unify all the messaging services, Facebook Messenger, Instagram messaging, WhatsApp messaging, on the same platform in an end-to-end encrypted way, meaning exactly that there's a massive weighting of privacy against security and accountability, external accountability. So I want to ask anyone on the panel how you think about that decision vis-a-vis the value of national security or safety. And then secondly, we're talking about targeted advertising here. End-to-end encryption, it's not that the government can't get access to the message, neither can the company, and so there's no targeted advertising against the content of messages that are transmitted through end-to-end encryption. So what's the monetization strategy if all of Facebook is moving, in its messaging services at least, to end-to-end encryption where you can't do targeted ads? Privacy and the monetization. Alex, you spent some time at Facebook. You want to start?
Yeah, so effectively the way you can think about this is, like I said, Facebook has traditionally been in the center of this triangle of optimization. Zuck has pulled the lever all the way over to the privacy side. He is throwing over, he has tried to tweak and to fix things, and I think he has realized he has gotten himself in a trap where nobody will be happy with his content moderation decisions, and where everybody, the same people, can complain there's not enough privacy and you're not invading people's privacy enough. The people I don't like, you're not invading their privacy enough. And so he has flipped the table and said, we're going all the way to the privacy side, and that will have economic problems for the company, but we'll figure those out later. That has happened multiple times in Facebook's history, where they have done crazy changes, and then somebody else figures out how to make money later. And so while Zuck seems very confident, I'm sure there are other people who are drinking heavily tonight, whose job it is to make the shareholders happy. So anyway, it's going to have humongous impacts. It is going to provide a huge amount of privacy to people. There'll be a huge privacy uplift. He's also kind of calling everybody's bluff, like, you wanted privacy, now you're going to get it. And the flip side of privacy is everybody's going to have to be individually responsible for the information they consume and the information they send. He's putting into everybody's hands, you are responsible for what you do online. I can't stop you from doing bad things anymore. I'm not going to stop you from doing bad things. Economically, how are they going to do it? They're working on a blockchain model for payments. You're going to have Zuckbucks, on your mobile device. And they will, because other people have tried this, but because Facebook can roll it out to 2.5 billion people, they will create a new supranational currency that will float. That'll be tied to a basket of multiple currencies, not just the dollar, that is going to be able to be used for remittances and payments around the world with very, very low friction. They will take a small percentage of that. I would not buy Western Union stock or Visa stock tonight, because if they are successful, they will be able to completely change how economics, and they will not need ads anymore. But it is a humongous gamble, right? Like they have jumped off the bridge, and they're sewing the parachute as a fall off the bridge, right? And so that's crazy. And then something I have said privately to my friends there and publicly on Twitter, nobody has made these decisions before, especially at this scale. I think Facebook needs to have these discussions publicly and needs to take the input from people, from law enforcement, who is going to freak out about this, from civil society, from privacy advocates. These discussions need to happen in the open, not just in private, because when they make decisions in private, they don't take all that input, and they also will always get in trouble with it. It is better to have a public discussion of how this trade-off works, because despite him having the big picture, there are tiny little decisions that will actually have a lot of privacy and safety and security impact.
So he didn't talk about encrypting newsfeed per se. So it is theoretically possible that he encrypts the other three but keeps newsfeed clean, in which case clear, in which case you can actually profile you and you can put ads on your WhatsApp or Messenger because they all tie together, and there's a profile available from what's happening on your newsfeed. Okay, firstly. But I think it should really scare us to think of more things becoming opaque. And the analogy that Zuck likes to use is like, it's like your living room. What's happening in your living room is private to you. What you're saying in a phone conversation is private. But these groups are 256 people. So you can, and in a couple of hops, you can be in 10,000 people. Now, what does that really mean? How can you have something that is unpoliceable, that is being transmitted to 10,000 people? Now, is there a point at which you can say it's effectively in the public space, and then it can be policed, right? So And that is a question we have to have as a society. What is the norm around what can be policed and what is really privileged?
Answer.
Well, I was just thinking back about the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace and all the promises that John Perry Barlow made in that, and where we are 22 years later. So I'm always, maybe it's my Dutch heritage, a little bit skeptical about very, very big promises, because I think there will be many factors impacting this. But I agree with what Alex said, that this is a way of calling the bluff. And we'll have to see what it leads to. I mean, I think this idea of getting input from many would have been a good thing to do prior, but let's see, because it's always hard to walk back while saving face if you made a big announcement. I never really see leaders doing that so easily, whether they're politicians or in the private sector. But let's see. Let's see. I think the big problem Facebook has, and Mark Zuckerberg personally has right now, that there's so much trust lost that it's going to be hard for people to take this as at face value and to think, oh well, he says A, so he must mean A, so let's read it as such. I think a lot of people are going to read, and I already saw initial responses, are going to read ill intention into it.
But that's great. It doesn't matter though. Like, they're going to do it or they're not going to do it, and it's going to be mathematically proven or not. And I think that's what he's doing. He's like, you don't have to trust me. If I mathematically build this, that everything's encrypted. And so civil society, governments had an option here. And the only laws that have passed around here have been pro-privacy, right? None of the laws, none of the legal requirements that have been put on Facebook over the last couple of years, especially from Europe, none of those requirements have been around responsibility or safety. Mm-hmm. They've all been for privacy. And so he's partially reacting to that. GDPR might destroy the entire idea of online ads in Europe. If he's reacting to that, then this is it. But this is kind of, like I said, if you say that's all we care about, is all we care about privacy and data control, and data should never leave because Cambridge Analytica was the worst thing that ever happened on the planet, and running ads is immoral, then this is the kind of outcome you're going to get if these companies are going to survive.
Yeah, but the question is whether it's going to be allowed, I think, still. So I mean, of course it has to be mathematically proven, but I'm thinking about American law enforcement now, because I think Americans hate their government unless it's about national security, and I think government is pretty hands-off unless it's about national security. So if suddenly all the communications of people across different platforms are going to be sucked out of public sight, I think we may see a first move on the American side.
Right. It is definitely a pivot. It's a pivot away from China because he can never go back to China now. That is dead as long as the Chinese Communist Party is in charge, probably. Right. But it's also a pivot away from America because you're right. For most of the world, it is massively privacy enhancing because this data has been available to the U.S. government under FISA and FAA 702, which is the whole point of the big fight and the privacy shield and that. And so. For European citizens, you now have the benefit of the American government has no access to the communications of your citizens. The flip side is European governments have no access to the communications of their citizens. And so that is the weighing that's going to have to happen. And so the privacy people are going to be super excited. Privacy Shield doesn't even matter anymore because this data is completely out of
By when do you think this could have been, by when do you think this is realized? Because it's not that, it's been announced now. So what is a realistic timeline for this?
So I think pretty clearly he's leaving his options open of how far they go, right? So people have proven that one-to-one messaging, totally doable. Small group messaging, doable. Facebook has, WhatsApp has implemented stories, so Snapchat-like functionality, totally doable. Newsfeed, as people know it right now, I don't know how I would architect that to make it end encrypted. That is going to be very difficult. And so I think we're probably looking at 18 months to 2 years, at which point the namespaces are merged and you have ended encryption between Instagram, WhatsApp, and Messenger. And then now they've got a platform by which they can experiment of what other parts of Facebook can now be ported on top of this to make it encrypted. And then part of that will be what is the legal pushback, what has been the privacy pushback, what has been the safety pushback on us doing these things. So while he said this is something we want to do, he's really only promised it for messaging, which he's already done with WhatsApp. So he hasn't promised much beyond what has been kind of built in and accepted by governments. But you're right, just the announcement, there was, I am sure, an interesting phone call from Washington, D.C. to Menlo Park tonight. And I think the U.S. government and the other Five Eyes, because the other Anglophone countries can get access via FAA through requests of the U.S. government. So the Australians, New Zealand, Australia especially, has been very aggressive about encryption. They're going to be very upset about this.
All right, well, we wind up our class next week with a final session, no 1-week break. We'll see you next week on the 13th, but thank our guests for this fantastic discussion this evening.